Before we get to if God is for us, we have to ask the question, is God for me? So yes, no, or maybe. Some of you would answer with an immediate yes. For some combination of comparison, better than most, and credentials, a religious resume. We ask the question, is God for you personally? And you go, oh no, I'm not a yes. I'm a pretty solid no. And interestingly, for the same reasons, comparison. You kind of look around at all of the people around you and go, I don't know that I've got it together like they do. Like there's some stuff that I'm done. There's some stuff about the way I would identify myself. There's some stuff about the kind of person I've been that I actually think disqualifies me from being the kind of person that God would ever be for. Credentials, comparison, circumstances, they're lousy places to anchor a confident answer, either on the yes side or on the no side. When it comes to whether or not God's for us, these are questions that have the capacity to totally change your life. If you got a Bible, go ahead and grab it and meet me in Romans chapter 8 this morning. We're going to be in Romans chapter 8, and go ahead and bookmark it. We'll be there for the next 5 weeks, and really just the last 8 or 9 verses of the chapter. Romans chapter 8 is where we're going to be for a new teaching series we're starting this week called 5 Questions That Will Change Your Life. At some point or another, I think all of us have probably been reminded by some well-meaning person that there is no such thing as a stupid question, which, to be honest with you, is an encouragement that I have some questions about, especially in light of an article I read this last week about some doozies that the folks at Google have collected over the years, things that actual people have typed into the Google machine wanting answers to. One of them, should I tell my parents that I'm adopted? Feels like something that maybe they would know. Somebody asked, what does a quarter until 4 mean? A quarter is 25 cents, so why is it 15 minutes? Some of you will figure that out later. Are chickens considered animals or birds? My personal favorite, why are the holes in cats' fur always in the exact right place for their eyes? I mean, I get trying to encourage people to be curious, and especially for younger kids to encourage safety and learning, but I think that it's time to acknowledge that perhaps there are at least a few stupid questions. Now, sometimes questions seem like stupid questions because they are, Sometimes they seem like stupid questions, but they're not, even though they seem like it. Have you ever asked somebody where your sunglasses are, and then discovered that they're right there on your head? Not technically a stupid question, but it feels like it after you got the answer, yeah? I did have a coach, just full disclosure, tell me one time, a baseball coach say, Freeland, there aren't stupid questions, but there are stupid people, and sometimes they ask questions like the one you just laid out there. So maybe that's part of it, I don't know. There is another kind of question, though. It's not a stupid question. But it's a question for which the answer seems so obvious that you kind of wonder why the question even needed to be asked. And that's actually the point of the question. It's a question that needs to be asked because the answer seems so obvious, we'd never even bother to answer the question or to think about asking it. And those questions tend to be some of the very best questions. Some of the most profound questions that we ask, the kind of questions that can change everything for us. Maybe especially when we feel like we already know the right answer. That's what we get to when we come to the last part of Romans chapter 8, which is a passage that's meant to be read right after we've thought about resurrection for a while. Romans chapter 6 to 8, Paul describes how the resurrection has the power to change your eternity and also your everyday life. He gets to the end of the chapter and he invites all of us to respond to 5 rapid-fire questions that can help us gauge whether or not we're currently living into everything that's possible for us because the resurrection's true. 5 questions that might, for some of us, maybe even many of us, feel really, really, really obvious. And they do have some obvious answers, but the truth is they are not stupid questions. Because I think what a ton of us are going to discover, maybe over the next 5 weeks, is that even though they have what feel like obvious answers to us, answers that we would give if we were given the question on a quiz, and the answer that we live in everyday life are 2 totally different things. And that's why I think asking them one by one and taking our time is such an important exercise for us. And it's why we believe, and I generally don't think that we're overselling this. These are questions that have the capacity to totally change your life. Let's look at the first one. We'll look at it today. If you found Romans chapter 8, it's there in Romans chapter 8, verse 31. Romans chapter 8, verse 31, Paul's writing and he says, "What then shall we say in response to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us?" What's the obvious answer? Nobody. No thing. Nowhere. No time. Right? That's an easy answer to give. So why ask the question? Well, because I think what Paul knows that we have to understand is that even if we know the right answer, even if we know the obvious answer, the answer that he expects, the answer that we give can be a struggle for us to live. So let's just pick the question apart a little bit. There are a couple of questions that we have to ask ourselves inside of that obvious question, aren't there? I mean, Paul says, if God is for us, and some of us realize right off the bat, we can't always assume that. Before we get to if God is for us, we have to ask the question, is God for me? That's a pretty important question. So what would you say? Is God for you? So it feels like there are 3 potential ways that you could answer that question. They're the 2 obvious ones. You could say, yes, God's for me. You could say, no, God's not for me. And then those of you who have ever passed a note in junior high know that there's always one more that comes back to you after you ask yes or no. The note comes back with a new category for a new answer created there, and that answer is, yeah, maybe. So yes, no, or maybe. Is God for you? Well, let's just take them one answer at a time. Some of you would answer with an immediate yes. You would say, yes, God is absolutely for me. Some of us in this room, some of us that are joining online, a whole bunch of your neighbors would come to answer this question, is God for me? We would say, yeah, yes. We would immediately put ourselves in the yes category. And the reason that we would sounds something like this. Yes, God is for me. Why? I mean, well, I've never murdered anybody. I mean, I'm pretty good. In fact, I'm better than most. So if we stacked everybody up, I'm not perfect, but I'm probably better, I think, than the majority. Like wherever that median line is, I think I'm at least in the 51st percentile, maybe even better than that. And I when it comes to morals, when it comes to good behavior, I kind of think God's for those types of things. So I just assume when it comes to the answer, is God for me? I'm those things. So yes, God's for me. That makes sense. Some of us who would take the answer yes would take the religious answer to the question, the religious angle to that question. So, is God for me? You would say, well, I'm here. And to be honest, I don't want to brag, but this is 2 weeks in a row for me. I do the religious rituals. I'm from a religious family. My parents took me to church. I went to church. Maybe I give some money. Keep all of the important religious rules along the way. I'm obviously voting for, okay, maybe not that one. That on balance, got a pretty solid religious resume that I've built over time. I feel like all of that's got to be enough to put me and keep me in God's good graces. So we're in the yes column for ourselves, for some combination of comparison, better than most, and credentials, a religious resume. And that may be you. It's a bunch of our neighbors, yeah? Ask them. It's a pretty normal place to land in our world, but let me just play with that for a little bit with you. If you were to give a numerical value to your yes, what would it be? My friend Bill Crafton loves to ask the gates of heaven question. If you were to die today and stand at the gates of heaven, how certain are you that God would let you in? On a scale of 1 to 10, what's the number you would give for those of you in the yes column? Yeah, you have a number in your head? Most people, it's actually fairly rare for a person to give it a 10, on the basis especially of comparison and credentials. Even if we're pretty darn good, most of us would give it a 7 or an 8, It's on the confident side of the spectrum, but it's also humble, which is one of those credentials that we like to keep on the religious resume. So 7 or 8 is kind of where we'd put ourselves, on the higher side of the yes column, right? But let me just ask you this. If you were to go to the airport tomorrow, get ready to go on vacation, and if somebody was to tell you or you to find out, this plane has a 7 or 8 out of 10 chance of getting to the place that you're wanting to go safely, how many of us are getting on that airplane? Okay, so let me just state the obvious for you. That's not a high enough yes for your vacation. Is it a high enough yes for your eternity? When you put it that way, our 8 out of 10 yes for credentials and comparison sure doesn't feel like a very solid yes. A question that really matters. Maybe more of a maybe, or even a no. When we think about it that way, it kind of ends us where some of the rest of us showed up today. We asked the question, is God for you personally? And you go, oh no, I'm not a yes. I'm a pretty solid no. And interestingly, for the same reasons. Comparison. You kind of look around at all of the people around you and go, I don't know that I've got it together like they do. Maybe you look at the person that you're married to and say, well, gosh, she's so much further ahead than me. I don't think I'll ever catch up. She's been doing this for a long time. She grew up in a religious home. She's gone to church her whole life. She knows all of the answers. I don't know all of the answers. I don't compare to that. Or you're a no on the basis of credentials. You just think, man, when it comes to my religious resume, I got some stuff on there. I've been trying really hard, but the truth is I also have more than a few blemishes. There's some stuff that I'm done. There's some stuff about the way I would identify myself. There's some stuff about the kind of person I've been that I actually think disqualifies me from being the kind of person that God would ever be for. So I don't know, man. I think I'm a pretty solid no. We don't have all of the credentials and comparison. There's another reason that we end up on the no side of things, especially from time to time. It's not the comparison or credentials piece. It's actually the circumstances piece. We say, you know what, if I was going to be confident that God was for me, if I was going to be confident that God was happy with me, I would sure think I would be a lot happier myself right about now. The truth is I'm not happy right now. Things are not working out for me the way I thought they should. Even more specific than that for some of us. We're sick. We're broke. We're lonely. We're afraid. And God feels silent and distant in the circumstances. So straight away we would say, nope, no, he is not for me. He's against me. Or maybe I believe that he's for me up here, but I have a hard time ever getting the answer that I give anywhere down here to something I can live. Believed it, but I don't see it. I don't feel it, so I'm kind of doubting it's true. You know, there may be a few of us that would get to the yes side on the circumstances thing. Like we got a job recently, we got a promotion, got a big paycheck, finally got pregnant, dating somebody, aced the test we didn't study for. It's like, God's for me, yes. But whatever that is, whatever that circumstance is, it'll at least have to be a contingent yes, wouldn't it? Because we also know it's possible that things go poorly in the relationship that we're in. Things go poorly with our health at some point, that we someday lose the job, the economy slashes our industry. There got to at least be a contingent yes on the circumstances. It's like Eugene Peterson says, feelings are great liars. Circumstances are too. That roller coaster ride will rattle us, and none of us wants to be on it. So, here's the point. Credentials, comparison, circumstances, they're lousy places to anchor a confident answer, either on the yes side or on the no side, when it comes to whether or not God's for us. Which brings us to the book of Romans. If you know anything about the book of Romans, it was written to two different groups of people who'd all come together as a part of this thing called the church. They all were trying to answer the question, is God for me? There was a group of them who came from the Jewish background. Most of them would have put themselves in the yes category for the same reasons as some of you. You know, I grew up in a religious home. I've got the right last name. I've got the right religious pedigree, and I've kept all of the rituals. I've kept all of the law. I've tried to behave. The other group was the Gentiles, and many of them would have put themselves in the no category for the same reasons. I didn't grow up with this. All of these people know all of the answers. They keep all of the rules. I'm just trying to catch up, and I don't think I'm ever going to catch up. I don't ever think I'm going to be like these people. I'm not even sure I want to. Rituals didn't make sense to them. They always felt like outsiders, just assumed that they always would be. And then both groups came together as a part of this new spiritual family called the church. And suddenly the circumstances were against all of them. Persecution, suffering, economic slide, social pressure, political division, and everybody in the church's scale was tipping towards no. Existentially, eternally, and every single day. Back to Romans chapter 8, verse 31. What then shall we say in response to these things? If God is for us, with comparison and credentials and light of the circumstances, everybody as a part of that church had to be asking the question, yeah, Paul, but what if he's not? Except, a little Greek lesson for you. There are three ways to say if in Greek. One of them means maybe, maybe not. Kind of what we mean by if. You know, if I eat Mexican food today for lunch, I'm going to have enchiladas. But I might not have Mexican food for lunch. It could happen. It might not happen if. There's another way to say if in Greek that means if, and it's almost certainly not true. Okay? If the Sooners win the SEC in football this year, this is how we'd say it. If, that ain't happening. There's a third way to say if. It means if and it is true. An English translation would be since. Guess which one Paul uses here? What shall we say then in response to these things? Since God is for us, who can be against us? Paul says right here in this verse, these things make him a solid yes. Despite his credentials, despite his comparison, despite his circumstances, and that he expects us to be there too. So it feels like we ought to figure out what these things are, shouldn't we? It's really the whole book of Romans. And I'll give it to you in a series of 5 pictures we've used before. The first one is a picture of good news. It's how the book of Romans starts. Good news is that God designed us to live in relationship with himself. That's the good news. And you see it in Romans chapter 1. Romans 1 verse 20 says, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, his divine nature have clearly been seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse." That's good news. The God who is has shown himself to us. But then there's bad news. You see it in Romans chapter 1 through 3, says that we have suppressed that knowledge and that we have separated ourselves from the giver of life, from God's life and God's law. Romans chapter 3 verse 10 said, "There is none that is righteous, not even one." And even Romans 3:23 says it's all of us. Even our religious trying falls short of the glory of God, what God's revealed about himself. So good news and then bad news. Then there's, worse news. Romans chapter 6, verse 23 says, "The wages of sin, what we earn from separation, is death." In the words of my 11-year-old daughter's favorite theologian, Taylor Swift, "Play stupid games, win stupid prizes." When you and I choose to swan dive off the cliff away from a relationship with the life giver, look, it doesn't matter how hard we try after that point. It doesn't matter how good our form is or how sorry we are, or how religious we look on the way down, right? And check it out, it doesn't matter what family you're from at that point. It doesn't matter how much better your form looks than all of the other people that are swan diving next to you. It doesn't matter what the circumstances, what the weather's like on the way. Separation causes death. And Romans says that's every single one of our situation. So good news, bad news, worse news. How about some great news? Romans 5:8 says that God demonstrated his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. He paid the debt. He bridged the gap, took the penalty, and he offers us rescue and hope and forgiveness and power and life, even when we were on the way down. Which in Romans brings us to urgent news right here in Romans chapter 8, verse 31. What shall we say then in response to these things? Look, I can buy you an extravagant gift, but you don't possess it until you receive it. I can build you a bridge from here to Hawaii, but you don't go anywhere until you trust it. God can send a rescuer to pay for your sin and eternally reconnect you with him, but you can refuse to be rescued. You have to respond. So let me just pause right there for urgent news. What have you said in response to these things? Jesus came to rescue you. He came to die for you. He rose from the dead to prove that the debt has been paid and to offer you life and offer you his power. And he is inviting you to trust him. Is there a moment in your life where you came to the point of drawing an X through your credentials and your comparisons and even your circumstances and said, "I'm trusting Jesus as my only hope"? 3 possible answers to that question: yes, no, or maybe. This news is way too urgent for a maybe. If you're a maybe, I don't know if I've received that gift. I don't know if I've trusted God's solution by faith in Jesus as Savior. I don't know if I've trusted him. Don't assume. Don't wonder. Don't stay a maybe. At least know for sure from here today. Write today's date down and know I'm trusting him. I'm a yes. And if you're a yes to the urgent news, you can be 100% yes that God is for you today, whatever your comparison, whatever your credentials, whatever your circumstances look like. That God knew you and chose you and pursued you and called you and declared you forgiven and will finish what he started forming in you. Because for him to not be for you would make God to be a liar. For God the Father to be set against Jesus himself. So, that brings up the second big question. Since that's true, Paul asks, who can be against us? And again, under the circumstances, the Romans said, they could have said a lot of things. Maybe you would too, and that's not wrong. I mean, notice, this is not a Hallmark card, cheesy Facebook meme that somehow indicates everything's always awesome for the person that God's for. I mean, in a lot of ways, it's the opposite of that. This is a reminder that it often feels like the deck is stacked against us and God's on the deck. The Bible talks about three major things that feel like they're against us over and over and over. The Bible talks about the world and the flesh and the devil. The world can talk about the culture and the currents around us that just sometimes persecute the followers of Jesus or push the followers of Jesus. The Romans do something about that. Sometimes it's just the system, that pulls against our trust, from societal pressure towards moral compromise to things like greed or consumerism or individualism or busyness that you feel like you can't live without, but you also struggle to live with. The world, the flesh, that's the internal pull, the thing inside of us. Jonathan Edwards talks about our affections, the things that our hearts want that aren't God's best for us. Or sometimes it's the internal critic, the flesh, the ruminating on shame and guilt, keep calling us back to who we were when we weren't enough. The internal voice that feels like the enemy of life. The world, the flesh, and then the devil. There's a real, supernatural, personal, cosmic enemy who is the only rational explanation for some of the evil that we see in the world. The Bible says he's a deceiver, he's a disguiser, he's an accuser, sows seeds of chaos and confusion, but disguises it as truth and freedom. He seeks to keep you from life. And then if he fails to keep you from life, to keep life from spreading within you and from you. Paul's point is those are real enemies. The world, the flesh, the devil, they're great enemies, significant enemies, mighty enemies, powerful enemies, enemies which have already been conquered through the power of a great, significant, mighty, more powerful God. If God triumphed over death and the grave on your behalf, no enemy is any match for him. It doesn't matter where your story goes from here. If God's for you, who could be against you? So here's what it comes down to for all of us from here. If all of that is true, what would change for you if you really believed it? Since God is for me, who can be against me? What would change in your life if nobody, no thing, nowhere, no time was not just the answer that you'd give, but it was an answer you decided to live from here? Maybe for you, there's something in your character. You're just given up. You just decided, I'm never going to defeat this. I'm never going to get past this. Never going to get on the other side of this. I'm always going to be like this. Maybe you'd finally forgive somebody that hurt you. You've been afraid if you did, they'd win. You've been holding unforgiveness to make sure that the one who is against you doesn't overcome you. But in light of this, you realize you can forgive, because even if they could overcome you, they can't overcome you because God's for you. What would you do if you weren't afraid Maybe you'd finally trust Christ for eternal life. Maybe you'd finally go public with your faith. Maybe you'd finally walk across the street instead of just waving and bless your neighbor. Maybe you'd redirect a career path. What if in addition to looking for a next step out of high school or on the other side of retirement, in addition to just looking for where you could go to have a good time, you ask yourself how God would like to invest the next season of your life. Parents, what would it look like to parent a kid who's thinking about that? If you really believe this too. Look, I don't know what the answer would be for you. But what if you did? Or at least were willing to explore it. What would you do if you weren't afraid? You want something that will absolutely change your life, no exaggeration. Look back at this question and make the decision to live an answer, not just give one. That feels scary, huh? It's supposed to. If the answer wasn't at least a little bit scary, the question wouldn't have to be asked. But maybe think about it this way. Several years ago, the marketing geniuses at Capital One showed us the perfect image. Not just of the answer that Paul is hoping we'll give, but the way he's inviting us to live. Check this out.
With no fees or minimums and no overdraft fees, banking with Capital One is the easiest decision in the history of decisions. Even easier than this.
I'll take Barkley.
Yes, I still got it. I told her she picked me first.
Yep, even easier than that. With no fees or minimums and no overdraft fees, is it even a decision? That's banking reimagined. What's in your wallet?
You know the question none of us have to ask when the commercial comes to an end? None of us have to wonder who won the game. We don't even think to ask that question. None of us are stressing out because the kids are so small, they may not even be able to dribble. Every single one of us knows that if the right person is on your side, the outcome has already been settled, even before the rest of the game's been played out. And look, Paul's point, the step you're thinking about taking from here, the step you're afraid to take from here, you don't have to ask those questions either. And you're still invited to play the game out. Whatever role you're sent to, whatever fears and insecurities you bring, to be able to answer confidently, God is for me. The resurrection proves it. And if it's true and has been applied to you, the resurrection gives you the resolve to face down every fear. Don't just give the right answer. Live the true one. Would you bow your head with me? Father, this is that moment every single week where supernatural things happen in our hearts, where the Spirit of God takes the Word of God and begins to tailor it to our hearts. And Lord, I pray that you would do your work in this moment for the person that's still struggling with whether or not you're for them, whether or not they've ever put their trust in you, that this would be the moment that they trust you and begin a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Trust him that he has taken their sin, risen from the dead, and given them life. Lord, for some of us that are struggling with a decision that we know we would make if we decided to live the answer to this question, would your Spirit empower us to live like it's true, not just the answer that we'd give on a test? Would you send us, Lord, from this place as people that decide that we're going to put our trust in you for our eternity and also for every step of everyday life? We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Hey, thanks for watching. If something you heard resonated with you today, we would love to connect with you. Visit doxology.church/connect or leave a comment below. And if you enjoyed today's message and you want to see more, make sure you give this video a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new videos.